Welcome, northeastern tree fruit workers. Listen in while experts discuss what's on their minds this week, the second week of May 2021. The region is ranging from petal fall for some and just coming into bloom for others. Last week was a wet one for many of us, which was a much needed respite for those of us who are experiencing drought conditions, but also means that we saw infection periods for apple scab and for quince rust for those that are affected by quince rust. This would be a good time of year to scout trees for gypsy moth or winter moth, depending on where you are in the Northeast. These are sporadic pests as naturally occurring fungal pathogens. Usually keep them in check from year to year, but something to keep an eye out for, and it's not too late to go out and scout this year. With short spurts of warm weather and prolonged cool periods this spring, general consensus is that insect development is falling well behind the norm, certainly well behind tree phenology. Aside from some rumblings of oblique-banded leaf roller in western Mass and some black stem borer affecting test trees in New York's Saratoga County, we've heard little about insect development. Greg Peck mentioned that in his memory, this is the longest period between bud break and bloom he's witnessed in his test orchards in Ithaca, New York. That and lots of rain have meant several more springtime applications of fungicide. But that also means that primary scab season peaked early for him. Ascospore maturation was about 90% in Ithaca last week. So his primary apple scab season might be wrapped up by petal fall in Ithaca. However, Mike pointed out that in his region, they were at only about 20% ascospore maturation, so big differences in this phenomena from region to region. This week's call was a little different as we hosted some special guests to discuss soil health in the orchard and how new findings can be integrated into how we think about pest management. This discussion doesn't just cover the horticultural benefits of healthy soils, but covers all other kinds of benefits improving resiliency of these perennial systems. Find links below on the influence of soil health on diseases in the orchard, and stick around for a conversation on the whens and hows of weed management through the season. Keeping a weed-free strip is always important during fruit set, but there are some potential benefits of relaxing that hard and fast rule during other periods throughout the year. No matter which state you live in, you should be able to find local extension resources on how to assess your soil before planting an orchard and things you can do in established orchards. Please find the link below to Cornell's resources with manuals and opportunities to learn more at extension events. They discuss Cornell's Comprehension Assessment of Soil Health, or CASH, which walks users through the process of doing your own soil health assessments, when and how to submit soil samples, as well as how to set your own soil health goals, some of which might even include marketing strategies for your farm. So stick around for the full conversation.
So with that, we can transition. I know, I had sent out early in the week, we do have some guests with us today, Greg being one of them. So we have Greg Peck, Harold Van Ness, and Joseph Amzilli are the three that I currently see on the call. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but they're here today to join us to talk about soil health in the orchards and things that we can do to potentially, maintain or improve our soil health. And, this kind of came from, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. We've been talking about different interactions between diseases and insects and, kind of taking them from outside the normal field of our single disciplines and kind of thinking about it in the orchard where all these different factors are interacting with each other. And someone had brought up soil health and what that does to overall nutrition in the orchard and disease management. So just thinking about all those different connections, I thought it would be nice to get a little bit more background on soil health. So that kind of sets the scene, and I'll let the three of them introduce themselves a little bit more. So why don't we start with Greg? Do you have anything you'd like to mention?
Sure. So again, Greg, I'm based in Ithaca, assistant professor here at Cornell, and have been working on soil health for a long time in orchard systems, and continue to do some research on this area. It's been interesting that it's become a focus for some of our more mainstream growers. For a long time, it was very much so of interest to our organic growers and kind of a smaller segment of the population. I think in orchard systems, there's still quite a bit to learn about how to implement soil health and what it means. I think, to summarize the research quickly, it's hard to do, but one of the things that we notice is soil type really matters in terms of the effects of soil practices, things like adding compost or wood chip mulch to the soils. The more the soils with the higher organic matter, the more clayey soils tend to be slower to change. And of course, with perennial systems, we're not doing a lot to the soils on an annual basis. So a lot of focus should be on the pre-plant period. One of the things that I think is difficult to express to growers in terms of orchard crops and just perennial crops in general is that we don't always see a positive return in terms of tree growth or yield. So we can do practices, we know how to do practices to soil that improve soil health, quote unquote, do things like better aggregate stability, increase organic matter, more microbial, bigger microbial populations, more activity in the soil, but not always does that translate to something that growers see in terms of their trees or yields. And so I think for me, I think one of the points that we really need to think about going forward with soil health and orchard systems is what is the goal, and teaching growers about some of the positive benefits of increasing soil health that are outside of just, I'm going to have more apples per acre. And sometimes that's a hard sell to some of our growers, but based on some recent email exchange we've had amongst New York growers, there seems to be more interest now than I've seen previously.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I certainly, it does seem like interest is growing. So we're definitely hoping we can keep that line of communication moving forward. Why don't we, Harold, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I know some of you, actually. Anne, I'm going to shout out to you. Anne and I did some work about 20 years ago, I think, and I gave some talks in Ontario. Learned all about the Niagara escarpment from her and how important that is in terms of the local climate. So nice to kind of reconnect with some of you. So I am a professor in soil and crop sciences here at Cornell, and and I'm currently leading the soil health effort here. We have some funding that we get from the state of New York. We started to do soil health kind of seriously over 20 years ago, but some of it in a way precedes it. I remember actually doing some what you might now call soil health work with Ian Merwin, who is Greg's predecessor, and I actually was Ian's minor advisor for his PhD. So that dates me a little bit, but although Ian was kind of a late bloomer, to use no pun intended here. We have been in 2006. No, let me back up a little bit. So we felt that one of the things that we should emphasize, and we decided this very early, 20 years ago, was the measurement of soil health. That if you quantify it, if you measure it, then you can manage it better. And we've also, from that, by measuring a set of indicators, you guys are probably familiar with the Cornell Soil Health Test, or CASH, the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. We're learning a lot, but we have mostly focused on more annual systems. We started out more in vegetables and then field crops, and in terms of perennial systems, relatively limited. I mean, what Greg was mentioning, he's been doing some work. I think that's mostly what's been done with orchards. And then we've been analyzing a lot of samples for other researchers, notably folks in Washington State. who are doing, and Joseph will talk about that. So we, based on some of the recent discussions that we had, I mean, these were by email with some of you here in New York. We are thinking about doing more in perennial systems, especially with orchards, because it seems like the time is right, and there's an interest among the growers. What we can, so we have our soil health laboratory, and so one thing is to measure and see what we come up with. This is kind of what the folks in Washington State did, and that's what Greg has. I mean, there's probably more that we can do with Greg's data set. We do have some funding. Actually, we got an increase in funding from Albany, and in addition, there is a soil health legislation, a bill that is most likely going to be passing in the New York State legislature, and so there's a huge amount of interest, and so there's probably going to be funding associated with that for growers, that cost sharing and those kind of funding. There's also a lot of interest in carbon, of course. It's a big topic. So the stars are kind of aligning in that area. Here are some of my thoughts, and these are sort of random thoughts. So one issue is sort of the pre-plant versus post-plant analysis. So we've always kind of argued that, and I don't know what your recommendations are, but when you establish a new orchard or you replant, that's an excellent time to do an inventory of the health of the soil and what possible remediative actions might be appropriate. And then, of course, you have sort of the post-establishment soil health, which of course has a different set of management practices that you may want to consider, a little bit more maybe focus on ground cover management. So that's maybe something that we can sort of explore. And I will admit I have a bunch of apple trees in my backyard, but otherwise I'm really not an expert. So I would need to learn from you guys. There's a lot of educational opportunities. So we have, and you may be familiar with that, we have the CASH, the Cornell Assessment of Soil Health manual. It's a manual about the framework and how we conduct measurements and how we interpret data and things like that. We collaborated with some folks in horticulture, notably Marvin Pritz here at Cornell, and so there's kind of a vegetable, and notice it's a fruit. It's in that it's like strawberries and blueberries and what do you call it? Small fruits, I guess. Is that what you call it, Greg? Yeah. So there is a manual that was developed. That was maybe about 5 years ago, and we can from these various publications we can put other educational materials together pretty easily. We just have to do some adaptations, and which would of course need the involvement of the experts like you guys. So, and then, using these educational materials then to develop educational programs, that is certainly an opportunity, and that would be something that we can facilitate really quite readily. Especially nowadays, it's so easy now that we've all kind of gotten used to remote education. We can easily support that. But even in the future, if and when we can meet again in person, we can if you are organizing any events, we can support that. So that's maybe just some thoughts. It's just a sort of a preliminary discussion, and we'd like your feedback. So Joseph is he's the project coordinator for our soil health project. He's an extension associate and he's actually he's sitting right next door to me in his office on campus. Although it looks like he's somewhere being surrounded by cover crops. So Joseph pulled a few publications together from the Washington State folks. Like I said, they analyzed, or we analyzed quite a few samples from them. I think about 100, and so these are just some of the materials. Joseph, why don't you take over, introduce yourself, and maybe go over these materials.
All right. Well, it's great to be here, and you guys have a pretty robust group of orchard folk across the Northeast. So that's pretty awesome to see. Like Harold, I am not mostly been in annual systems, although I have a few apple trees in my backyard that I'm interested in trying to do some small cider stuff. But yeah, I think as I was looking up this, and it's funny, Tiana DuPont was part of this cover crop, or part of this cover crop work in Penn State that I was part of whenever I master's. So that was interesting to see that name pop up again, but now she's this fruit specialist, and you guys have probably seen these resources because this is your area of expertise. But it seems like in the last 4 years, they've had kind of a large on-farm research project. 100 of those samples were sent to the lab. And they produced a bunch of resources. And I sent these two and the final report to Mike in case folks haven't seen them. The details of the final report, I think their project's ending, so they just have all those details, and potentially it could be an example for what could be possible in New York State with your guys' leadership. I think their model was like 60 of the samples were paired, or 60 of the samples were 30 paired samples between areas performing well and areas performing poorly. And then they used that, and they also had yield on those. So they used that in their analysis, and some of their results were kind of interesting. A lot had to do with soil texture and stuff like that. But yeah, so these were some great results, and they also did like some arthropod stuff and some other things. So yeah, those are great resources. And I was just messing around with what's in our database, and most of this 78 samples from apple orchards probably comes from some view, and this is in New York State, and this is not including Greg Peck's trial, the Cornell orchards. So we have some data already. So potentially, and it seemed like potentially of this had already been kind of some paired on-farm research led by Greg Peck, and I don't know all the details about that, but so so there's some very coarse data summary. Yeah. And for the most part, when we just completed Debbie, probably a lot of these samples come from Debbie Aller, who couldn't make it. She messaged me before this, said she's busy with something, but we're working on a Long Island characterization of all the different cropping systems. And of course, our perennial orchard systems tend to be very healthy and in general, kind of alongside pasture systems. But yeah, I think it will be great to hear what your ideas are, like Harold mentioned, and go from there.
Maybe something just to add on to that. Joseph did a characterization of soil health for New York State, and it's available online. We can send you links if you're interested. And we looked at different cropping systems, processing vegetables, cash grain operations, dairy-based cropping systems, mixed vegetables and pastures, and didn't have enough samples really to include orchards. But as part of that, we were able to establish soil health goals, we call them aspirational goals. And we were able to do that by basically, because our database was large enough, i.e. we had enough samples for each of those cropping systems, that we could look at the distribution of numbers, so organic matter or active carbon, protein, you name it, and then establish the 75th percentile of that distribution. So we said like, well, that's a reasonable goal. That's an achievable goal for each cropping system. And obviously for perennial system like orchards, your expectations and goals around soil health would be different than they would be for, let's say, a cash grain like a corn, soybean, wheat type operation. That's also something that we can work towards, to develop those kind of metrics. It's a little bit, in line with, water quality and air quality standards, where we say, well, this is a soil health, we wouldn't call it a standard, but, we call it an aspirational goal, because standards is not really an appropriate concept in this case. So that's just another thought.
It says Moo's Dairy Farm on it.
Yeah. So this is an example from that distribution of different samples by texture and cropping system. Then we have the opportunity to kind of create some benchmarking figures that, given the really large interest in soil health and soil carbon and things like that, these are useful to gauge your management, but also potentially useful marketing materials for people. So that's could potentially be of interest.
And I should add that all interpretations for almost all indicators are differentiated by texture groupings. So you get, as organic matter is different for a clay loam than it is for a loamy sand. And so you have to make appropriate adjustments there. So that's always part of it. And maybe one interesting sort of fact that came out of this sort of extensive analysis of the New York data is that cropping system and how soil is managed has about the same impact on, you might say, soil quality as texture. So, we think in terms of, we look at the soil survey, we say this is a Rhinebeck clay loam or whatever else it is. And so a lot of the properties are, of course, strongly influenced by texture, but we're seeing this differentiating of many of the soil quality indicators also by how long-term management has occurred. And that can be either like a cropping system, especially a cropping system where most of the carbon and nutrients are being removed, and annual systems, like if you think about, say, corn or soybeans, you're growing the crop and then you remove basically about 55% of the carbon and maybe up to 70% of the nutrients, because you harvest the grain and you ship it somewhere else and it's not being recycled. And orchard systems, of course, you have less disturbance, and you probably, I don't know how much of what fraction of the total carbon that you harvest and remove. So that's a number that I don't have in my head, but the cycling and flows of carbon and nutrients is a strong determinant in terms of impacting soil health. And that's as well as, of course, things like disturbance and tillage, which is obviously very different for orchard systems than for these annual systems that we've been mostly looking at.
I wanted to say that I think in orchard systems, and it's also true of vineyards, we're using a lot more chemicals, pesticides than I think row crops do in general. And I wondered if that's been looked at specifically in terms of soil health.
I know antibiotics has been looked at, Dan, in terms of is that affecting the soil bacterial communities, and the results were not in any significant way. And so that paper, it just came out a couple years ago. I can't think of the lead author. I can dig it out for you if you're interested. The interest in that, of course, is because of all the attention on antibiotics in agriculture and potential for restricting the use. And So for Harold and Joseph, we use antibiotics for fire blight, which is a devastating disease, and we use it during bloom quite a bit.
I know that Kyle Wickings has also done a little bit of looking at the impacts of fungicide use on microbial life in golf course soils. And so if you can imagine the barrage of fungicides that those soil microorganisms get, that's a pretty good acid test. I haven't caught up with what he's doing recently. Do you all work with Kyle?
No, I'm not all that familiar with the literature in this area. I know that people have looked at Roundup, of course, because there's so much controversy around that. And as far as I know, that people haven't really seen any impact of that. But you'd think that fungicides and insecticides would possibly have some impact. And I would assume that it would depend on the chemistry and the mode of action and things like that. But we'd definitely have to do a literature search on that.
So this is Dave Rosenberger. We know that some of our fungicides, and particularly copper, are pretty detrimental to earthworms. How important are worm populations in soil health?
They are important. You know, there's sort of an interesting ecological issue around the invasive species, and notably the night crawlers and the more native species. But in terms of enhancing the physical quality of the soil, so porosity, especially macro porosity, stability of aggregates, and all that, earthworms are very important. I mean, Charles Darwin, decided to study earthworms even. So yeah, we know that they are very, very important. And so if there's something like I can see copper applications and even, legacy copper contents in the soil, that would be important. That's something as part of our soil health package. We have a standard set of indicators, including chemical indicators. And then if are particular concerns about certain contaminants like heavy metals, then we can do a total elemental analysis, which includes the digestion. The normal chemical analysis is just the standard nutrient analysis, which is the modified Morgan in our case.
When you monitor soil health in orchards, are you monitoring exclusively under trees or within the tree row, or is it an average including the tree row middles? Because I think, especially as the orchards get older, there will be a huge difference between the sodded areas and the area under the trees that are heavily impacted by herbicides in most commercial orchards.
Dave, I've looked at that in different trials, just kind of out of curiosity to see. Usually for our research samples, we're interested in the soil where the roots are. So we're looking in the tree row, and usually also at different depths. And we find that, of course, the top 6 centimeters or so of depth, soil depth, is where all the activity is. And we don't get much change in orchard soils below about 6 centimeters in most of the projects that I've done. But in terms of row middles versus tree rows, you don't see very much change over time in those tree rows. I think there is a question now with the amount of precipitation we're getting in the summer and the amount of compaction we get in the tractor ruts. I think we can, really kind of break that apart and think about it. But 80%, Harold and Joseph, 80% of an orchard is grass that just gets mowed, a bunch of times a year, and that's pretty much it. Usually it gets a carbon addition because the prunings go in the row middles, and then most growers will chip them up. They'll have a mower go through and it just decomposes slowly over time. Actually, so we add a lot of carbon back into soil.
That goes into one of my questions, which has to do with this kind of long-standing management strategy that I would say most wholesale growers take, is that weed-free strip. So what Greg said is that 80% of your orchard is a nice grassy surface, and the rest of it is going to be weed-free, grass-free, so that you don't have competition with weeds and trees. And it's especially important for sizing up fruit during the end of the year. For a lot of our pick-your-own orchards, that's actually less of a concern. And I've been hearing a little bit of rumbling from people doing pick-your-own that have an orchard floor that's much more like a cider production system where you would have 100% grass. Like, do you think those two systems would have dramatically different, like, would you have a dramatically different message when it comes to the benefits of soil health for either of those different groups? Those three different groups, really.
So I guess yes. I think you kind of answered your own question, right? You're managing the soil differently, so you might have different end goals there. Ian Merwin did some really nice research early in his career showing that a weed-free strip wasn't really necessary especially for established trees beyond the middle of the summer. And that actually there was a benefit to having some ground cover come up in the tree rows in the late summer through the fall for soil health reasons. He didn't use the word soil health at the time, but now we would call it soil health for things like compaction from rain and erosion. And those roots go in and infiltrate the soil and help to break apart the soil some. So the idea that you need to have a weed-free strip through harvest, I think, is debatable. And I think that might be an area to kind of consider in terms of doing some additional research in tall spindle types of systems, high density systems, to see if that still holds true.
Does anybody have any feedback there? Are you going to get a lot of balking people who are used to decades of the recommendation of weed-free strip saying you don't need a weed-free strip anymore? Any response?
Well, it's when, Anna.
Right.
It's very important to say when, right? So mature orchards past the middle of the summer, right? So, Ian's research, and it's been shown many times now, it showed that early season weed control is very important, right? So when for for establishing young blocks, but also then for established blocks through the cell division phase, in particular of fruit development, right? So first 30 to 45 days after petal fall, having that weed-free strip is really important so you don't have competition for water and nutrients when the trees are at their most susceptible to water and nutrient deficiencies, or competition, I should say.
Terrific. And actually that leads into my other big question. And I want to get around to a question that Anne put in the chat too, which is when we're thinking about taking some of the things that you all are learning and injecting them into our educational programs, it's really important to me to think about when to think about these messages being best applied, right? So something I heard you say is that understanding what kind of soil you have would be important, and maybe thinking about introducing that idea to people when they are planting trees, because that might be a good idea to think about, like, oh, like this is my soil if you don't know already. Anne wants to know if anybody has looked for assessments and replant of apple orchards. So like maybe let's try to get to that too. But I'm also thinking about when are some other times where we could be inserting these lessons, right? So like maybe when we're talking about irrigation in the heat of the summer and thinking about, water retention and healthy soils, that like maybe irrigation would be a bigger problem for you. Like when we're doing tissue analysis during certain times of the year, like when do you think would be the smartest time to bring up these topics through a growing season?
I'll just throw in here too. I think one lesson that we need to think about is when a block's getting ripped out, and how long is that ground being left between plantings, and what's going in that between time. I think that's a big area of opportunity when we talk about where can we possibly make some improvements to the soil health, because I think for a lot of the commercial growers, we're limited to what we can do in season, but I think we can do a lot in between plantings too. So looking at different cover crops, I think that could be a big area. Before we move too far forward, just a quick question for Greg on Ian's work. Those trees, were those like Central Leader 111s? And do we know how that really translates up to, a 3x11 tall spindle?
So I don't remember the specific spacing, but definitely, this was in the early 90s, so more of a vertical axe system. He
Okay.
did some work in apples. He did some work in peaches as well. He had a project down. Maybe Dave was involved in that in the Hudson Valley, looking at different types of ground cover management systems on peach orchards. In terms of when does weed cover matter in a tall spindle system, I'm not sure if that work has been replicated. I haven't done that specific question. It might be a good one and pretty straightforward sort of project to run. Could be a nice demonstration project to work on with growers too. Just what Ian did was I think he did weed control by month. So it was like herbicides were applied in May and in June, in July, and then August. And then he did like some combos, like all 4 months, or the first 2 months and the last 2 months. It was something like that. So he had a number of different treatments, but it was just kind of when in the season does weed control matter? I think, this brings up a very important point too. When we talk about soil health, and it's easy, and we get excited when we hear Harold and Joseph talk about soil health. We think so much about the soil and the soil properties themselves, but we know it's true for all ag systems, but in tree fruit, we're also thinking about weed control. We're also thinking about soil fertility. We're also thinking about water management. And, no discussion of soil health with the growers, Anna, really goes without thinking holistically about all these other factors that, when you do something to the soil, it's going to impact all these other parts of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, from an educational perspective, or how you interact with your audience, the concept of soil health is really is this more holistic approach, and the first idea is to really kind of make people aware of, because most practitioners have been, especially if they're a little longer in the tooth, they've been more educated on sort of the chemical management, and they know P and K and pH and that kind of stuff. And so the first step is to sort of make them aware that that there's the biology and the physics of the system as well, and how they all interact, because it's really sort of a more of a planning based approach, and not as much a reactive management where you say, okay, I see a problem and then I apply X chemical or something like that. You really have to kind of plan these things ahead. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a real-time management component to it, but in terms of what we want to do is to sort of make sure that people understand, and we always use the analogy with human health. Most of us staying in good health is really sort of a lifestyle thing, rather than sort of doing the right thing at a particular point in time. The other thing that I want to mention is disease, and I know it's an issue, and not that I know much about disease management, but one of our earlier collaborators was George Bowie, who is a plant pathologist at the Geneva station, and so he developed this bean bioassay, where you look at the health of roots, and Tiana DuPont at Washington State, what Joseph was mentioning, used that as well. And I think that's basically the samples that went through our lab. But having a sort of an effective bioassay for soil-borne disease pressure, potential soil-borne disease pressure, whether that actually exhibits itself in a particular growing season probably is dependent on weather conditions, but that may be something that you may be more interested in than, say, like a corn or soybean grower. We know that the organic vegetable growers are very interested in that bioassay for the obvious reasons.
So, Harold, do you know if that was an assay, since it was George, working with nematodes primarily, or was it just looking for all sorts of potential problems?
Yeah, it's basically, I mean, George, of course, did a lot of work with nematodes. But he decided, and we decided that that the assay needed to be relatively simple and low cost. So the idea here is to grow, to take the soil sample to grow a sensitive a plant, which is a common bean, then grow it for 4 weeks, and then wash the soil off the roots, and then look for symptoms like lesions, necrosis, and things like that. And it really, is quite effective. And it may be one of those things where, I don't know, Greg, did you in your samples, did you do the bean bioassay as part of that?
I did not. I think where it would be most useful would be pre-plant, because that's when we could identify if there's a pathological reason that might be contributing to a replant disease syndrome.
And then obviously the compaction has a really important linkage with disease incidence, and due to having more saturated environment for soil-borne pathogens to proliferate, and also weaker plant. So that's an important consideration as well.
Greg, I'd like to go back to your comments on Ian Merwin's research concerning the importance of early season weed control. And I think what Ian didn't examine is the impact of a weed cover before bloom. I don't think there's any significant damage from weed cover that comes in up until bloom. And by allowing early season weed cover, we can establish some residual organic matter and soil coverage that then persists through summer. So I'm going to put on the chat group a link to an article I published in Scaffolds about 3 years ago. I don't have data to say it has no negative effect, but it seems to me that a chickweed cover, which can be established because it reseeds quickly and can be quickly killed with herbicides around bloom, provides a lot of soil protection, and in my experience, allowing a little bit of late season cover and then that early season cover really increased the amount of organic matter in soils over a period of time under the tree row. The problem with late season cover, as you know, is that managing the amount is very difficult, and if it's too heavy, we run into vole problems in winter. So I'm actually more optimistic about allowing some early season cover to develop before we kill it with herbicides each year. That means keeping the residual herbicide levels low the previous year, and also not using fall pre-emergent herbicides, because then you'll have no cover in the spring. For larger growers, this probably isn't feasible, because you can go from a manageable weed cover in pink to an unmanageable one at petal fall if the spray conditions don't allow you to cover all the acreage. So I realize it's not feasible for everybody, but I think it's an area that needs more, what should I say, less bad publicity based on Ian's work that really looked at what happens from bloom on.
Okay, so I'm so sorry, because we do have a hard out at noon, because I actually use this room for a class I'm teaching. I'm so sorry. I feel like we're just getting started here, and I would like to have another hour. But what I think maybe might be a good way to do it is put a pin in this conversation. And kind of what I'm taking from this is, we have some really actionable information to hand over to our growers who are planning an orchard or planning a replant. And then my question for you all is, like, of course you have Greg to work with, but would you like feedback from us as far as like, what are our needs from an educational point of view or a research point of view? Like, what I could do is say to the group, send me all your thoughts and comments and say, oh man, we really need more information about X, Y, or Z. And I can put that together into like a little package for you. I mean, is that the kind of input that you're looking for, or feedback, or what would you like to achieve by meeting with us?
Are you asking us, Anna?
Sure.
Yeah, we're very open. I would like to more turn it around and say, well, are you interested in soil health, and do you want to work with us? We can facilitate a lot for you because we have developed a lot of educational materials. We could look more into the data, Greg's data, the Washington State data, whatever else data we have available. We haven't really, done a more rigorous analysis. But if you say, we'd like some fact sheets or some things like that, then we can collaborate on that. Maybe Joseph, I'm just not that knowledgeable on these systems, other than a little bit that I got from osmosis working with Ian and a little bit with Greg. But if you guys are kind of like willing to work with us, we can facilitate a lot on that. And so what seems to be several obvious opportunities. One is developing some educational program, and whichever way we want to do it, fact sheets, or maybe we want to do it in a more 21st century way, and the other one would be to do some quantification, to maybe develop a sampling program. If for those of you from New York, we do in principle have funding to do that, and maybe Greg has some funding as well. So we can definitely facilitate that, of course, from because it's state funding. For those of you outside New York, it would be a little bit more complicating. I know that there's a couple of Canadians participating as well, and I know that there's some soil health assessment capabilities in Ontario and Quebec, I believe, as well. So that at least maybe some level of coordination would be workable.
All right. Well, I see we're just about at noon, and I guess Anna, you're going to start having students popping on soon.
Yeah, I think.
So I just want to give a big thanks to Harold and Joseph and Greg for joining us today. I think we could keep talking about this for hours. So really appreciate you all for joining us.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. Nice to meet you, everyone.
Yeah, our pleasure.